This is Barnat from UN Habitat.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 2021 Innovate for Cities Conference. My name is Megan Tran, and I'm going to be one of the MCs for this really exciting global yet local conference hosted by the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy and UN Habitat, co-sponsored by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that the Innovate for Cities conference will be taking place all over the world as participants tune in from their respective lands, which are also the traditional territories of many Indigenous peoples. Personally, the land that I will be presenting from is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. The meeting place of Toronto, also known as Takaronto, Canada, is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and is now home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. I'd like to invite participants of this conference to also reflect on the land that you currently reside on, and in recognizing these acknowledgements are only the first step to decolonization, to reflect on what decolonization would mean in the work that we continue to do on city-level climate action and innovation.
Hello, I'm Ellen Lindsay, and I'm joining you all the way from Accra, Ghana. You can read more about Megan, myself, and our third MC, Madison Miller, in the speaker section of the event platform. This piece of housekeeping is a good way to introduce our role, and we are here over the next 5 days to provide you with a welcome to you, our amazing 5,000 strong audience before each plenary session of this conference, and to also help you to navigate your way through our huge program. So we will encourage you to look into the many features and spaces of the online platform, to visit the Knowledge Center, and to contact the help desk if you have any questions or need assistance over the next 5 days.
So before we hand it over to the hosts of our first plenary, we want to acknowledge the conference organizers and hosts of this Innovate for Cities conference. So Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy and UN Habitat, and to our co-sponsor, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. To our partners, Resilience First, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, Melbourne Center for Cities, UNESCAP, UNEP, UNDRR, Cities Alliance, Coalition for Urban Transitions, Urban Sustainability Directors Network, UCCRN, World Bank, World Resources Institute, Future Earth, Student Energy, UNU, CDP, ICLEI Local Governments for Sustainability, OECD, IIED, Planners for Climate Action, Metropolis, and the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Thank you for guiding the organization of this event through the Partners Network Organizing Committee.
So we also want to acknowledge our amazing regional curator teams and our 500 strong presenters in almost 200 sessions who have ensured this global conference features the intersection of cities and climate change science, and also with true local context, providing an important opportunity to review the gaps in knowledge and priority themes uncovered in the global research action on cities and climate change. So speaking of the Global Research Action Agenda, you will hear the GRAA acronym many times over the next few days. This is a key outcome of the first Cities and Climate Change Science Conference in Edmonton in 2018. So our speakers throughout the conference have responded to the themes within this agenda. And here I must also acknowledge our Science and Innovation Steering Committee, because they have overseen the conference's objective and proceedings, and along with our writing and rapporteur teams, will review and update the GRAA as a key output of this conference. So importantly, the conference and its output will also feed key messages into the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP26, as well as provide input for the 7th assessment report of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCCAR's 7th Special Report on Climate Change and Cities. We want to make this conference as participative as possible and encourage you to kindly take advantage of the different ways to provide input during the live sessions in the Knowledge Center throughout the conference.
This conference has something for anyone interested in the intersection of climate change and practice, and it is an exploration of the current state of decisions needing to be made and the information, knowledge, data, and science available to help now and what is needed in the future. In the design of this conference, we have concentrated our efforts to include both the wide range of themes and voices engaged in innovation and transformation throughout the different sessions. However, we also acknowledge that certain fringe issues or voices might not always be represented. One example of this could be the social justice dimension that's often associated, which is often not prioritized by certain sectors. Therefore, we encourage you to include such reflections in your session comments. Please feel free to incorporate these thoughts in the chat functions or in the discussion boards, and the survey available, both of which can be found in the Knowledge Center. If you have any technical questions throughout the conference, please head to the Help Center located at the bottom of the homepage. I would now like to warmly welcome to the virtual stage the moderators for this first plenary session, Marnie McGregor, Communications Director of Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, and Bernard Barth, Acting Program Coordinator for Climate Change and Urban Environment from UN Habitat. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Megan and Ellen. And today we are here to really kick off this great conference, global conference. And the focus of the session today, which is really the opening plenary, Cities, Climate Change, Science and Innovation. And we know we've heard quite a bit already about the 2018 conference. I'm a Canadian, so in my hometown, not my hometown, but knowing we've got Councillor Ben Henderson with us from Edmonton, and we're going to hear quite a bit about that conference where the Global Research Action Agenda was drafted and how that has really been a guiding framework for a lot of the work today. And we want to look back at 2018 and see what happened back then and what has happened since then. We know there's quite a bit that's happened, including a global health pandemic and lots of innovation from cities. And we want to really look at the progress that's been made in a fast changing landscape and what are those unprecedented areas of impact. So I'll turn it over to Bernard and we can kick it off from there.
Thank you very much, Marnie, and welcome everyone. Just ahead of COP26 and taking the new insights of the recently released IPCC Working Group 1 report into account, what is the importance of cities? How does the city level relate to other government levels, especially when it comes to implementing pathways that help securing 1.5 degree scenarios? These are some of the questions, and of course, the core topic of this week's conference is how science can drive better implementation of climate action, and how do insights from implementation drive new research and innovation agendas? Which partnerships are needed, and what are priorities for implementation in the next few years? Before we dive into the sessions, may I remind you to engage via Twitter or post questions and comments in the chat. So 3 years after Edmonton, it is important to take stock and updating the global research and action agenda, taking into account the COVID-19 pandemic and further gaps that have been brought to light over the last few years. So before we do this, we would like to go back to 2018 and hear from the partners from the Cities and Climate Science Conference. But before doing so, Michael Bloomberg, the co-chair of the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, and the UN Secretaries General Special Envoy on Climate Ambition and Solutions, and the founder of Bloomberg Philanthropies, will provide welcome remarks. Over to Avi for that, please. Can we have the video, please?
Hello, everyone. As the world recovers from the pandemic, we have an opportunity to rebuild in a way that also makes us more resilient to the next crisis. And we don't have a moment to waste because that crisis is already here. It's climate change. To confront it head on, we need to be bold and ambitious. Research and innovation have always been central to finding and implementing solutions to our biggest problems. And we know where that usually happens: in cities. Because cities have always been hubs for testing new ideas and technologies. So it's up to all of us to support cities as they help lead the fight against climate change. At the Global Covenant of Mayors and Bloomberg Philanthropies, we're doing just that, with our partners at the EU, UN Habitat, and the International Panel on Climate Change. But we need others to join us, and with COP26 just a month away, our hope is that governments around the world will answer the call. Thank you.
Thanks to our co-chair, one of our co-chairs of the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. And now I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to the Executive Director of UN Habitat, Maimouna Maud Sharif. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me here. Yeah, Excellencies, Honorable Ministers, Honorable Mayors, distinguished representatives and participants, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Innovate for Cities 2021 conference. This is also the second Cities and Climate Science Conference, bringing together UN Habitat and the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy in partnership with the IPCC as the co-sponsor. Many of the partners of the first conference in Edmonton, as well as numerous other individuals representing a wide range of organizations, have actively supported the preparation for this conference, being part of the Science and Innovation Steering Committee, as well as the Partners Network Organizing Committee. We would not have such a diverse event that covers all time zones without the regional curators who are coordinating region-specific events and the mayoral receptions. I would like to thank every one of you for the tremendous effort that you have put into strengthening our partnership. I would also like to add my thanks to the organization that have provided financial support to the conference, the European Commission, Resilient First, and the University of Melbourne. I'm told that more than 4,000 urban stakeholders have registered and are attending this conference from every region of the world, representing a wide range of sectors, national and local governments, practitioners, city networks, grassroots organizations, think tanks, academia, and the private sector. The Innovate for Cities 2021 conference comes at a critical time. The critical report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, warns that human-induced climate change is already causing extreme weather across the globe. At the same time, the COVID-19 health pandemic continues to ravage economies, resulting in social and political crisis. Globally, exclusion and injustice within countries and within cities could be widely seen. The health and economic impact of COVID-19, climate change, and inequality are all linked. Cities are at the center of this interconnected crisis. As we begin to see a pathway out of the pandemic, we are also seeing a new consensus on the urgency of climate action emerging, driven by national governments, private sectors, companies, international financial institutions, civil society, and indeed, cities and local government. We are fortunate to have so much energy in our sails as we make our way to Glasgow. We must seize the opportunity to make climate change mitigation and adaptation the basis for all future development. At the launch of our common agenda, the United Nations Secretary General provides us with the framework for concerted action. He calls on us to strengthen global governance, focus on the future, renew the social contract, and ensure United Nations fit for a new era. At UN Habitat, we hear the call for more solidarity and for better multilateralism. This includes harnessing the energy from our partnership for commitments to climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. At UN Habitat, we excited to co-host the Innovate for Cities 2021 conference. So the evidence-based, scientific, and research-based solution is what we need at the local level. For the Innovate for Cities conference, I hope we can arrive at a collective action plan that is accompanied by viable financing strategy. As a former mayor, I know that the solutions need to be localized and tailored to different financial capacities for cities to take action. The Innovate for Cities 2021 conference is focused on green recovery, climate justice and equity, positive transformation and innovation, and also the conference will showcase how cities from every region of the world are rolling out climate action. Cities are also investors and laboratories for innovative solutions. Many cities globally have committed to ambitious targets, aiming to achieve carbon neutrality earlier than 2050, with some cases of cities like Glasgow that will be carbon neutral by 2030. I congratulate them. Meanwhile, we must also empower and enable cities in the developing world to make the same commitment. And indeed, citizens of the developing world and urban poor in developed ones have the smallest carbon footprint, but will suffer the most from climate change. And today, we are asking the present and future generations to pay the heaviest price for carbon release in the atmosphere by the industrial and post-industrial world. So the Innovate for Cities 2021 conference has a crucial duty to harness the goodwill we have at the local and regional level to develop an action plan where all cities and communities can support, invest, and commit to implement. It is crucial that national and local government works together to define a shared roadmap towards carbon neutrality. So the COVID-19 recovery efforts offers a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to ensure the economic growth is low carbon, inclusive, and resilient. Recovery pathways will either entrench the world in a high carbon, high pollution trajectory at odds with the Paris Agreement and the 1.5 degree goal, or pave the way for an inclusive and sustainable transition. So cities and communities must have a seat at the table in the global environment discourse. Deliberation from the Innovate for Cities 2021 and the conference will fit into the COP26. So the time to COP26 is short, but collectively we can still raise the level of ambitions. So as many of you are aware, we entered the Urban October with a number of celebrations around the globe. And just last week, on Monday, 4th October, I was in Yaoundé of Cameroon for this year's celebration of the Global Observer World Habitat Day with a theme of accelerating urban action for a carbon-free world. And the observant bring together ministers from various countries, mayors, head of UN agencies, and a Nobel Prize winner, and international footballer, and representative of the African Union and local government networks. I would like to take this opportunity to invite all of you to take part in the celebration of World Cities Day on 31st October with a theme, Adapting Cities for Climate Resilience. So this is because cities worldwide are increasingly suffering the effect of climate-related disasters such as flood, drought, sea level rise, heat wave, landslide, and storm. I will participate physically the Global Observant, which will take place in Luxor of Egypt. Thank you very much for your attention, and over to you, Marina. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Executive Director, for setting the scene and for providing the broader context for the conference. We are now showing a short video on the journey from Edmonton to this conference that we are starting here today. Over to you, Evie, for showing the video.
When I think Edmonton, I think about leadership vision, and boldness. You see, Edmonton is the capital city of the largest oil-producing region in Canada, and yet, in 2018, it was home to one of the largest gatherings in the world of two important communities, climate change scientists and city policymakers, looking for on-the-ground solutions and the evidence to take more action. This event was important for accelerated action on climate change because it was about identifying gaps in cities and climate change science globally and for forming relationships between academics, urban practitioners, and policymakers to help cities tackling climate change at the speed and scale required.
Well, as we all know, climate change and rapid urbanization are two of the global megatrends being experienced in the 21st century. And as a result, cities are not only increasingly impacted by climate change, but also key actors in responding to it. And science and research are important to us in this world because we need evidence to improve our understanding of the impacts of climate change on the world's cities and of the range of possible adaptation and mitigation responses. Certainly, as we've seen with the COVID pandemic, better scientific evidence means more informed decision-making. And in the case of climate change, that will enable us to secure a more sustainable and equitable future for both human and natural communities in urban settings.
The City of Edmonton was really proud to host the first ever Cities and Climate Change Science Conference right here in the heart of Canadian energy country. And we've felt that it was really important to show leadership on climate change because of the energy transition that our city and economy is going through. And so in order to broaden out our perspective, we also invited mayors to a summit in the days prior to ensure that city leaders could come, take on board the science, and also provide some perspective on some of the gaps from local leadership perspectives. And out of that, and engagement with the academic community and subject matter experts at the conference, along with the elected officials, was born the Edmonton Declaration, which calls on cities to act much more urgently on climate change and also to proceed from a very, very strong evidence and scientific basis. Now, the city also took the opportunity in the public-facing part of the conference to do a lot of engagement with our citizens, with our business community, with civil society, and with our academic community here in Edmonton. And it was really, really beneficial for citizens and media to see that happening and for our city council to be able to see that, touch that, and engage that as well. And ultimately, all of that public-facing engagement, including, of course, the scientific activity that was happening, the thoroughbred research conversation that was happening, that helped us to really mandate the use of evidence-based decision-making in setting even bolder energy transition plans for our city coming out of that conference. And also, the exercise of the declaration gave us an opportunity to engage with cities and climate networks and the scientific community broadly to encourage bolder city leadership as well as subnational and national government leadership. But at that time in particular, the role of cities was really, really front and center. And so it was a great way to bring it together here in Edmonton.
Global Research and Action Agenda was the main output from the Cities and Climate Change Science Conference in Edmonton. Conveners of the plenary and parallel sessions filled in templates to guide the identification of research gaps and recommendations from the presentations, questions, and discussions in their sessions. We also got similar information from poster presenters and authors of papers commissioned for the conference. Writing teams were established for each section, and experts were drawn in where expertise was lacking. The Global Research and Action Agenda contains 4 cross-cutting themes, 6 key research areas, and 3 approaches to facilitate collaboration between communities. In this way, the communities gathered together in Edmonton contributed to a roadmap of the most important topics and knowledge gaps that required research and action going forward.
This was a conference of many firsts. The first time the scientific community focused its attention on the role of cities in combating climate change. The first time cities and city networks gathered with technical experts to align climate efforts. And the first concrete example of the multi-level collaboration enshrined in the Paris Agreement. Now, I've always believed in the leadership capacity of cities and city networks to solve big problems. But at that moment in 2018, I think we all needed that replenishment of hope to refuel our fierce sense of urgency for action.
Thanks for that. From the Edmonton, great history and look back to the opportunities that we had back then and the potential for moving forward today. So Bernard and I are going to give now a welcome and quick introduction to the stage of our esteemed guests that we have with us today. First, we will hear from Francois Engelbrecht, who is an IPCC lead author and a special report on global warming of the 1.5 degree and the sixth assessment report. So the focus that we're hoping that Francois will bring with us today is some of the key takeaways of the new recent IPCC report that received so much media attention, rightfully so, and what are the most relevant elements for cities. We particularly are interested in hearing about the regionalization that was brought forward in this report and how does that trigger some action from regions and cities. And we're also interested in speaking to the implementation of what regions and countries can do differently, given the urgent message that we have. So welcome to Francois, and we'll look forward to hearing from you now.
Thank you so much, Moni. And Moni, can you just remind me how many minutes I have for this overview I should give? Not too many, I'm afraid.
5 minutes, I think we have.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me jump in. Good day, colleagues, to everybody across the world. Let me start by just giving a very brief overview of the main findings of the IPCC Assessment Report 6 Working Group 1 report, and then I'll talk about implications for regions and cities. I think we need to start by the assessment that global warming has now reached a value of 1.1 degrees Celsius. That's the best estimate we have available. And for all of us working also on climate change impacts, that means, of course, that we are now very, very close to exceeding that first dangerous threshold of global warming, namely 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming. The other startling finding of the report is that it has assessed that it is now more likely than not that we will exceed the 1.5 degrees Celsius level of warming. And that is even in the presence of a so-called best effort mitigation. So what does this mean? In the IPCC report, we've considered a very strong mitigation scenario. We effectively cut emissions every year with 5% to achieve halving emissions by 2030 for the world as a whole. And from there, of course, continuous reductions occur until we achieve carbon neutrality in 2050. Now, even in such a scenario, the report assesses that it is more likely than not that we will exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that exceedance, the best estimate of when it will occur, is almost upon us. It's the early 2030s. On the positive side, the report also assesses that with this type of best effort mitigation, our chances are excellent of staying well below 2 degrees Celsius. And if we can invent new technologies that do not exist today to be applied at scale, namely carbon dioxide removal technologies, if those can be in action in the second half of the century, then there is a chance that we can return the world's temperature to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. But that really sets the tone of the report. It means it is now extremely challenging to avoid dangerous climate change. The changes that are needed now are not incremental, they are transformative. That's the only way, the only type of change that we can now have in the mitigation space that will still give us a good chance of avoiding these most dangerous impacts of climate change. Now, from this baseline, this report has gone further than any other IPCC report in the past to give a detailed overview of the main changes that we can expect across a large number of different climatological regions in the world. And this regional aspect of the Working Group 1 report really gives all the ingredients that the IPCC Working Report 2 needs to discuss climate change impacts, including impacts on cities. That is, of course, the big report this community needs to keep its eyes open. It's the Working Group 2 report that we expect in February next year. I would like to conclude by mentioning 3 key risks for cities, 3 examples of the type of regional information you can extract from the report that is directly relevant to adaptation in cities. I'm going to use my own region, Southern Africa, as the example. Like for many other parts of the world, the report assesses that in this region, over the next 20 years, we can expect the occurrence of unprecedented heat waves. Now, let me remind everybody in this call what happened just a few months ago when an unprecedented heat wave struck in the Pacific Northwest. Hundreds of people died in British Columbia and the northwestern states of the US because this type of heat wave is just not known in that part of the world, and there was no air conditioning. That's how direct the vulnerability can be explained that we've observed. Now, in the part of the world where I live, millions of people live in informal settlements. They don't have air conditioning. They often don't even have easy access to cool water. And many of you will know, for an elderly person under these circumstances, a heat wave literally is life-threatening. I'm gravely concerned about a lack of adaptation plans in Southern Africa's informal settlements, just in terms of this direct risk of heat waves. The report then also assesses that this very same region is likely to become drier with more frequently occurring droughts. Now, even Southern Africa's best cities in terms of being modern, having some infrastructure, a city like Cape Town is extremely vulnerable for multi-year droughts. 2015 to 2017, we had an unprecedented drought, and it brought us to the brink of a so-called day zero event where a city runs out of water. This report is clear that this type of drought will become more frequent across all the big Southern African cities. Finally, I want to point out to everybody what happened in Mozambique. March 2019, tropical cyclone Idai struck, and 1,300 people lost their lives in Beira in Mozambique. An unprecedented storm, the biggest flood disaster in the historical record in Africa, south of the equator. This report is clear that the cities on the eastern seaboard of Southern Africa is now more vulnerable to the occurrence of intense tropical cyclones making landfall. So what do I want to say in a summarizing sentence? Adaptation is critical in strongly for. This really must be the financing goal. And a key element is financing adaptation in the cities of the developing world. Very last point, if I may, just one more point, money. What will this adaptation cost us? What will adaptation cost us in the developing world, in the developing cities? We don't have the science to tell us what climate impacts will cost us, how we can reduce those costs through investing in adaptation and by investing in mitigation that can still prevent some of these impacts to occur. And with that, I think my time is unfortunately up. I hand back the floor to yourself, Mani. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Francois, and thank you for setting the stage of the urgency of the crisis that we're living through, particularly around adaptation and financing. And I know cities, the Global Covenant, we know that cities can be a big part of that solution, but that much more needs to be done in terms of supporting them. I'm from Vancouver. I'm living in Athens, so I lived through both of those unprecedented heat waves that you're referring to. So I think that's a very important. Thank you so much for highlighting the urgency and the work that you've done to bring this to light with the call to action. Now we will welcome a Canadian, fellow Canadian, Councillor Ben Henderson, who is a member of Edmonton City Council, and would like to hear from him with his perspective of the work that we saw a little bit of in the video, particularly focused on what has changed since Edmonton in 2018, and how important from your perspective, given the work that you're doing on the ground as a councillor and in the community, what has in fact changed, and did this conference act as a catalyst to drive some of that climate action change at a local level? So over to you, Councillor Henderson.
Great, thanks very much for that. It's interesting, building on both what the mayor spoke about and what Francois has just spoken about. I think there has been some large changes in the way we've approached things, and I hope they have a profound difference. I think it's yet to be seen, and I'll just explain that a little bit. The mayor spoke about the Edmonton Declaration, which was essentially a commitment to do what we needed to do as a city to meet the 1.5 degree targets. And that was something that we encouraged many other cities around the world to join into, but it also meant that we needed a rigor of our own. We couldn't just put something down on paper and then continue to do what I think has been the history in cities of not meeting those goals and those targets. So one of the largest ideas that I think came out for us, and I hope will have a real effect in terms of that rigor, was the lessons from the city of Oslo, who had looked at a carbon budget to go in parallel with their financial budget. And it was something I think that we were quite intrigued by, because we had a history of setting targets and then getting 3 or 4 years down the road, 5 years down the road, and going, oops, we've missed it again. And it really felt that if we were going to get anywhere, we needed to stop doing that. We had to be real. If we were going to set these targets, they had to be real targets, and we had to know if we were getting to them. So we latched onto the idea of a carbon budget, and we actually went back and calculated what we needed to do in terms of how much space we had in that carbon budget and to meet the 2030 or 2050 year targets that we were talking about. And it became really clear that if we kept on going the way we were going, if we were doing business as usual, we were going to blow through that budget in 8 years. We weren't even going to get to 2030, and it would be completely impossible for us to meet what we had said we were going to do in that Edmonton Declaration if we didn't actually rethink. And that was based as well on what was already our plans. So we needed to go back and rethink everything that we were doing in terms of actually meeting those targets and actually following those targets and actually making sure that all the decision making that we do is tied into that. And that's where we're at right now. We have built in a system. We redid our plans of how to get to 2030, how to get to 2050, what we needed to do in order to get there. I'm not going to pretend that we have all of those answers yet, but we have a much clearer idea of what we need to achieve in order to actually meet those targets that we set out for ourselves. And we sent our administration back to actually come up with a way of measuring not just what we spent in terms of our capital budgets, but our operating budgets, and measuring what that would do in terms of that expenditure of the carbon that theoretically we had left or didn't have left, probably more to the point, or ways in which we could build the budget back up again by capturing carbon out of the system. So that's where things are at right now. It is much easier said than done. And it's not a quick process to come up with the kind of measurement I think that you need to have in order to do that. But the commitment is there. I think by next year, when we go into our next 4-year budgets, it will be a tool that will be in place. And I think more importantly, we will also use it as a way of measuring how we are doing in the shorter term, so that we're not sitting there in 2030 once again going, we've missed our target. We'll be able to tell year by year as we go along how we are doing and whether or not we need to up the game and where we're failing and where we need to key back in. Now, I'll also say, I think that one of the real challenges around this is one thing to have a look at our own operations. It's one thing to look at our own capital expenditures. That's just a small part of what we need to do as a city, because a great deal of what has to happen is for our entire population. It's not just in our own operations. And And the goals are going to have to be that carbon budget. All of those kind of policy pieces are going to be not just about moving our own behavior, but moving the city's behavior as a whole. I would say just really quickly, because my time is running out on that one of the things, and just picking up on what Francois said, I think there has been a huge shift in the perception of our population. You cannot go for the number of years now we have with these extreme heat events, going now 3 or 4 years with real problems with smoke from forest fires without the public beginning to realize that this is real. And that there is an urgency to this, that there is an emergency component to this. And I think that is making the discussion and the conversation much easier with our population. That even in an area of the world that is oil rich, that this is not sustainable, and that there is a real urgency to do something, and it is already affecting people. And I think they recognize that in a way they probably didn't recognize it in 2018, or didn't really truly understand in their own lives. And I think that gives us hope that some of the difficult and challenging decisions that we're going to have to make in order to be able to hit those targets that we've now set for ourselves with that new rigor, I'm hoping that the public will be there now for us in a way, and supporting us in a way that I don't think they would have been 3 or 4 years ago. And I think that's that's the sad reality of the real consequence we're beginning to see for global warming. So I'm out of time, and I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Councillor. Really looking forward to the panel discussion where maybe we can delve a little bit more into that with the public. That's a really great topic and the tracking and metrics work that you're doing to actually meet your targets from the declaration and beyond. Thank you so much. Now, next we are honored to have Mayor Mohamed Ridwani from the city of Leuven, from Belgium, and it is currently the EU Capital of Innovation. And we look forward to hearing from you, Mayor, on the debate, how the debate of climate change, how has that impacted your discussions, and particularly the pandemic, and how that's impacted some of the city's perspectives on climate and the public as well. And as the EU Capital of Innovation, how in fact does innovation really bring that action to and change at the speed that you're looking for? Over to you, Mayor.
Thank you, and my greetings to you all from Leuven in Belgium. Well, I think like in so many places in the world, and especially in cities, we can see the impact of not only the pandemic, but also of climate change, and especially with in Belgium we have more floods than ever. And this summer, together with parts of Germany and the Netherlands, I mean, we've suffered a lot. So the sense of urgency is bigger than ever. Now, when it comes to Leuven, we have developed not only a big sense of urgency and understanding why we need to take action, but I believe that over the years now, we also have developed a how to tackle this huge challenge on a local level. And that's also why we were awarded the Capital of Innovation by the European Commission. Since a couple of years now, I think 5-6 years, in Leuven, we have structurally bundled all the efforts that are being taken by the city, university, knowledge institutions, companies, citizens, and it was so shattered. So many things were happening, but it was shattered, there was no coordination. So that is why together we have created one new governance model, which is called Leuven 2030, which is in fact a new organization, but co-managed by all these stakeholders in a co-decision making with clear rules of play, and everyone can become member. So you buy a member card, you get into this it's an NGO structure, and you can coordinate the action plans and the climate policy, in fact, to the city. The City Council has given away the policy for climate policy to this organization, and as also has been done by the other institutions. So over the years, many things have happened. Through this new governance model, when it comes to results, we have a roadmap towards 2030 with numerous of scenarios, how and what kind of action we need to take. And a lot of action has been taken. If you come to Leuven, our city center is like almost car-free. It's a new mobility plan, pushing out car traffic, upgrading the public space, making sure the city is greener. We have stronger water and waste management, and we insulate and renovate our buildings at a very high pace. So a lot is happening and is coordinated by Leuven 2030. In fact, you can get elected from the General Assembly in the Board of Directors, which gives you also exposure. But to avoid greenwashing, every partner that is in the board should present a binding action plan, and it is also followed up. You can go to the website and you will see the evolution of the CO2 emissions. So in Leuven, a lot of things are going forward. One thing is going backwards, is the CO2 emissions. We're tackling them and they go down. So my main message is that when city leaders in all sectors of our society believe that bundling of powers, of efforts, when you have empathetic leadership, when you believe in the creativity and diversity of your community and you bring that together with a clear focus on a shared ambition like tackling the climate change, then wonderful things can happen. And we have the ambition now to really make a blueprint of how you can collaborate and have radical participation, because that is what is happening now. Every citizen in Leuven can be part of this idea. And next to the results, and that's my ending remark, is that it creates a huge sense of belonging, a huge sense of, I can contribute something which is meaningful. And that is also something that we urgently need in this world today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mayor Ridwani, for your inspirational 5 minutes talk. I think very important that you explained how things are moving forward, the rapid pace, which I think is very inspirational, but also the governance system behind it. And also, I think very important for this conference is the metrics that is behind your system. So thank you very much for that. We stay at the subnational perspective in terms of the analysis, but we go to Lamia Kamal Jawi, the director of the OECD Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, and Regions and Cities. So it's my pleasure to introduce Lamia, and maybe you can focus a little bit how the COVID-19 pandemic revealed the close relationship between environmental risks and those to the foundations of human well-being. What is the way forward for resilient and green recovery in cities and in regions? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Bernard. Hello, everybody. Thanks for UNHabitat and the Global Covenant of Mayors for inviting me. And greeting to Marnie. Yes, indeed, Bernard, if there is one thing positive about COVID-19 is that it has contributed to putting the climate agenda back at the center of the stage. At a time when economic and social impact of the pandemic are dominating the news and our attention, we have seen that more and more people are now concerned about the destructive effect of climate change, and nowhere is this more visible than at the local level. Our analysis that we have been conducted at the OECD since the onset of the pandemic on the regional and local responses to the crisis clearly show that local leaders have been taking bold measures to invest in a green recovery. And we have seen many mayors turning this crisis into an opportunity to do things they had long desired, but that were not acceptable in the past, because today they can count on the support of their residents and representing an international institution working mainly for national government. This is quite different from national government. They have been facing more resistance than at the local level. So as we near COP26, we have now to acknowledge that the role of cities and regions in the climate change agenda is now widely recognized, widely documented. And this is a sea change since COP19 in Copenhagen, when I remember mayors could not even enter the premises of the conference because they were not part of the conversation. And I remember they had to gather in the city hall of Copenhagen instead. And the Paris Agreement has definitively changed the game. Some national governments are now including in the conversation, and cities have been leading the charge. They have leveraged data, science, and technologies to reduce their carbon footprint and adapt. They have made substantial investment. Our work at the OECD showed that some national governments are already responsible for 55% of climate and environment related spending and 64% of climate and environment related investments. And the potential of cities and regions to lead a green recovery is huge, but to deliver on that potential, the enabling condition and framework must be put in place. And I want to make 2 points that I think are not always considered enough when we talk about the role of cities and regions in the green recovery and their role to address climate change. The first point is that climate change is, of course, global and systemic, but it is also territorially different within countries, and the capacity of some national government to respond to it is equally different. At the OECD, we focus on this granularity, and our data show that not all places within countries are equally impacted by and prepared for the impact of climate change. And for example, we have collected data for 1,200 metropolitan areas and 2,500 regions across OECD countries. And we found that since, for instance, 1970, cooling needs, which is the measure for how long and by how much, outside air temperature was above 22 degrees Celsius, have increased by almost 55% in OECD cities on average, but they have more double than in cities like Athens, for instance. So we have a lot of differentiated impact. We have also collected evidence that variation in estimated emission per capita is much larger within one country than between different countries. So this granularity also is poorly documented. The estimated impact of decarbonization on employment can also be much higher in some regions than others. On average, for instance, in the OECD, only 2.3% of employment is in sectors at potential risk from climate policy, consistent with the Paris Agreement. But we have seen again with our granular data at the subnational level that in some regions within countries, this may exceed 6%, and this is the case of the Guangdong region in Korea or Silesia in Poland. There is also large differences in the financial, technical, and human capacity of some national governments to address climate change. And for instance, we recently conducted a survey across more than 50 cities and regions of all sizes from around the world, which showed that 2/3 of them, 73%, do not have enough funding to fully implement the green transition. And this leads to my second point. Addressing climate change needs to be a shared responsibility across different levels of government. Recognizing the crucial role of cities and regions does not mean that they should do the work alone. And here, national governments should play a crucial role, not only by setting priorities, providing incentive, but also through the national urban policy framework. And together with the UN Habitat, we have recently released the 2021 Global Monitoring of National Urban Policy. And the good news is that now close to half of the cities, half of the countries, of the 162 countries we survey have included climate objective in their national urban policy. So we are definitively making a lot of progress. Thank you, Werner.
Thank you very much, Lamia, for that great overview. And certainly you also provided a great segue to the next speaker from the national government. And then I introduce Dr. Hugo Isaac, who is the urban coordinator of the United Nations Office from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mexico. And he's also representing Marta Delgado, who is the Undersecretary of Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights, and the President of the UN Habitat Assembly. So a very important person for my organization. Hugo, with soon more than 2/3 of the world living in cities, the climate challenge is de facto an urban one, and we have heard the many dimensions so far already. But how can better interaction between local and national entities drive climate change acceleration? What is the role of national governments and city networks and global organizations to drive local action?
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister, dear mayors, excellencies, representatives, the co-organizers, dear participants. On behalf of Marta Delgado, Vice Minister of Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and being the elected President of the first United Nations Habitat Assembly, I have the honor to address the virtual gathering of urban stakeholders and Innovation for Cities Conference. We gathered in the midst of the climate change and the COVID-19 crisis. We have heard previous speakers treat that cities are the center of this crisis and many of the most vulnerable people live in cities. And yet cities continue to grow on the underrepresented rates, and so is urban vulnerability and poverty. We recover from the current socioeconomic crisis. We address the current COVID-19 health crisis based on the public health policy. And in the immediate future, we change the course in the way we approach the climate crisis and the host charts and the path towards the resilience and sustainable economy. Social and environmental system must be decided and implemented now. The way cities are planned, built, and managed is key to reducing carbon emission and keeping global warming within the limits set by the Paris Agreement. Cities must also crucially build the resilience of their most vulnerable communities and infrastructure and urban system as a whole. Cities must also move into the new urban era. Cities should take a hyper-connection and digital transformation role and thereby solve existing problems and generate a better quality of life. To make this work, cities and urban areas must position themselves as pioneers and combating climate change and be ensuring that their needs for local climate action are well articulated and reflect in the NDC revision process. National governments must include urban action in their climate plans and local officials in their planning process, including and the finalizing and begin to implement the new around for NDC. This can also simulate financial support for cities, for example, from international funds or from national climate finances source, and better sustainable projects and well-designed frameworks for local government funding. Cities and incubators of change and act as laboratories for innovation solutions to enable cities to get on a net zero emissions pathway. It is crucial that local governments approve with financing, building capacities and transfers innovation technologies. This is particularly important to the cities of the global south to enable them to measure, report and verify on their climate ambition. The city starts from the stage and generic city, and in this sense, cities are incubators of change act as laboratory for innovation solutions. To enable cities to move toward a zero net emission transformation, it's a critical local governments and brands and have funding, capacity building, and innovation technology transfers. Mexico submit EU update NDC on 30 December 2020, committing to in conditionality reduce its emission by 22% below a business as usual. Visionary by 2030 and up to 36% below a business as usual is conditional or even financial, technical, and capacity building support. I want to speak a case example from Mexico as a part of the public agenda for global climate action, as well as the things between the climate agenda and the fair and green socioeconomic recovery. They have contributed to placing climate change and the forefront of the agenda of national regions and local governments in Mexico. A good example is the collaboration between the local governments of San Nicolas de los Garzas and United Habitat. As a part for a comprehensive participatory process, the municipality has defined a city vision that prioritize urban resilience to climate change and sustainable urban development and source management. A climate action plan, the development of participatory urban resilience programs for climate action projects, the creation of a municipality fund for the transformation of great infrastructure and the reconnection of the blue-green infrastructure network of public space and urban gardens are traceability action. They are part of facts to take them as an example, replicate things, management models. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Isaac. That's very interesting. We're looking forward to picking up a little bit in the panel discussion on those Mexican examples. And thank you for your work with UN Habitat and the leadership on that. We want to turn quickly back to a couple questions for Mayor Ridwani, who I know has to leave shortly. So Mayor, can I just jump in and ask a couple questions on the work that you're doing in Leuven to hear about the next steps, like given the urgency and the crisis that you've got immediately in front of you with some of the gaps that you've identified, what are some of those immediate steps given the urgency in the next few years of what your areas of focus on? We heard some of your great examples of things, but what's sort of keeping you up at night, or what are the things that you're working on immediately?
Well, I try to sleep at night so that during the day we can do the work that is necessary. In the next years to come, we would like to make a big step ahead on some big changes that we need infrastructurally. We try to work with the metropolitan region so that in terms of public transport, for example, we will do big investments to make sure that we reduce the car usage by 50% in the next 8 to 9 years to come. So we will still require huge investments, but we'll do it. We will need to invest in resilience so that we see that these heavy rainfalls that we see, we need to have more capacity of absorption. So less concrete and more absorption capacity. And then, it's still the use of fossil fuel to heat up the buildings is also one of the major sources of CO2 emissions. So there we need to do the big step forward in terms of renewables and insulation of our homes and buildings. And for the rest, I mean, it will require collaboration. It will require participation as well, because if our citizens do not adopt the sense of urgency, if they do not see why we need to invest and that it will require efforts from all of us, then we won't make the steps necessary. So that's what will be required in the next year. But again, I think that the basic layer of Leuven 2030 as a governance model, which is again not a network, but really a co-decision-making platform, where you also have this kind of, we're working on civic contracts at this moment, where the engagements are made more formal. So that if the city says we will insulate so many thousands of homes, that we will make it formal and visible. That each citizen, even if they undertake small action, they can make it visible. Our companies and knowledge institutes, so it's something that is reciprocal, and you can make it visible, and the engagement can be made visible. That's one of the instruments that we will develop in the next period to come.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your participation and your leadership. Over to you, Bernard.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mani. And with that, I'd like to go back to Francois. Francois, you have very clearly highlighted the urgency and the need to action in particular at COP. Yet many people who have followed the release of the IPCC report might feel that not much has changed over the last years or since the last IPCC report was published. What is your take on that?
Thank you, Bernard. I'm very happy to disagree on that position. I'm more optimistic ahead of COP26. What I've experienced and what I've seen for a start in the international media interest in the report shortly after its release until this day is a new sense of urgency, that the window to avoid catastrophic change is closing, and that we now need to take transformative action if we want to avoid the most dangerous impacts of climate change. And also if we want to prepare for the changes we are already committed to through adaptation. For me, towards COP26, I think the chances are excellent that we will finish COP26 with the strongest climate pact we've ever seen. I think at least 5 of the world's 6 major economies are going to commit to halving their emissions by 2030. And achieving carbon neutrality by 2050. And that is going to shift the momentum towards the renewable technologies with wonderful opportunities for the cities that choose to respond strongly in terms of implementing their own mitigation plans. That, I would say, is very, very positive. Things have certainly changed. It's now 3 weeks ago, I think, that China also announced a major shift in its own policy by stating very clearly that it will no longer fund coal-fired power abroad. For a country such as my own, it sends a big and important signal. It's unlikely that we will ever build another big coal power plant again. Another sign of change is that in South Africa, all our big fossil fuel companies have now greatly enhanced their ambition in terms of mitigation. Now, it is not as strong as they are being criticized of not committing to halving emissions by 2030. The South African collective new nationally determined contribution is more in the order of a 30% cut at best. That is being criticized of not being sufficiently ambitious, but I would say the bigger problem is that realistic? And that's my concern, Bernard, and that's where I will agree with you. What has not changed is materializing that commitment of funding flowing towards the developing world, both in terms of the funding the just transition towards the renewable forms of energy, but just as important in the developing world, funding ambitious adaptation projects, including projects for infrastructure. For example, the seawall that we need in Beira, or the road infrastructure we need in Beira to evacuate people when a intense tropical cyclone is approaching. And to conclude my response to your question, I here want to link up to what Lamia has been talking about in a more positive sense about what we can learn from the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm afraid that the vaccine inequality that we still see in the developing world and in Africa. Now, I think the latest statistic is still less than 5% of Africans fully vaccinated. I'm very concerned that that inequality will also remain working across the developing world when it comes to financing adaptation and financing the transition towards renewables. Isn't there a very realistic chance that once again the developed world will look after itself first, also in terms of adaptation investments, and that these investments will not reach the developing world in time for these transformative changes we have to make given the climate change impacts we are already committed to? That's unfortunately where I have to agree with your point, Bernard. In terms of mitigation and transition, overall, I remain very positive towards them.
Thanks very much, Francois. Of course, we do want to hear some positive messages, but I think you've also very clearly outlined some of the gaps where we need to really focus collectively to advance much faster than we have been. Thanks very much. Over to you, Moni.
Okay.
Thanks. This question's for Councillor Henderson, and the it was very interesting to hear your perspective on the public and how that's changed since 2018, and how that may in fact make things a little bit easier from a local government decision-making perspective. What do you think is still lacking, either in terms of that, either convincing people or public support in order to do what you feel like needs to be done from a mayor and council perspective? Or is there funding, for example, to rapidly scale, or any other things that capacity? We heard other speakers speak of capacity quite a few times. So I'm keen to hear from you what you think is still primarily lacking.
I'm quite intrigued. I mean, I think one of the things that's become clear is, from a city perspective, we have to show leadership, and that means in our own operations. But the real challenge for us is in actually moving the entire larger population. And I think we know what some of the technical answers are. I mean, I think one of the things that's important to remember and has become really clear is that it's human nature to want one magic wand answer, and there isn't one magic wand answer. It's all of the above. And a lot of the impediments there, I think, are financial. I think there are some really interesting things that we may be able to do in the way we finance individual changes in behaviors. I mean, one of our big challenges, for instance, you know, and I've just to echo some of what's already been said, is in our buildings, and we have a huge building stock that desperately needs to be retrofitted. And that's a big enough challenge. If we're going to get to net zero on those buildings, we need to go back to this massive building stock. And we know technically how to do it, but how you actually create the financial conditions that will happen, I think, is one of the interesting challenges, despite the fact there's operational savings there for individuals. And I think how you can begin to bring those two things together may help. But we're still, one of the things that really frustrates me, and I think we may have some regulatory tools around this, is that we're still building buildings that we know are going to have to be retrofitted in 5 or 10 years from now. And why we're not building them right to begin with is, again, a financial obstacle, that we can't convince builders that that's where the money should go. We can't convince people who are buying that it's worth their while to do that. And I think we are getting very close to the point where, if you begin to look at the operational savings in there as well as the capital costs, that in actual fact, we may be getting close to the point where it does make sense for people to make those choices. The other piece of that puzzle, though, that I think is really important to remember, and I think, and you know, I realize that this is still a first world perspective I say this with, but this, you know, the answers to this cannot just be answers for the wealthy, cannot just be answers for people that can afford it. That in a Canadian context, we're really beginning to understand that there's an equity lens on here, and that some of the people that are living in what we're now recognizing is an energy poverty kind of situation are the people that can least afford some of the solutions that we can put on the table, and that we have to step up on that as well. That it cannot just be answers for the wealthy. And you know, I think if you put that into an international context, it takes on even larger ramifications. But I think even within a first world context, there's a lot of people who are living in sieves for houses, and as a result spending way more than they should on their energy. That may be some of the really big wins for us. If we can figure out how to get in there and fill those gaps, and make sure that this is, as we deal with this, that this is something that that our entire population benefits from, and not just those who can afford it. So I mean, I too am hopeful. I mean, one of the other things I'll just add in right now, I also chair the Green Municipal Fund, which is a national fund funded by the federal government. It's $1.5 billion. That is money that allows us through low-cost loans and through grants to help municipalities move beyond business as usual. And I think one of the other really good news stories, just to say that I think this understanding that we have to do something that goes beyond just Edmonton in the Canadian context, is that for the first time ever, we cannot keep up with the demand from municipalities. for projects. We are being overwhelmed. So there is a huge interest in the Canadian context. And despite the fact we have significantly more money than we had 4 years ago, I mean, the federal government's tripled the amount of our endowment. So we're still not able to keep up with that new demand. And so I think there is a great interest across the country in municipalities actually stepping up in a way and moving beyond business as usual in a way that just was not there 4 or 5 years ago.
Great, thank you so much for that, Councillor, and definitely a good model to follow, the Green Municipal Fund, and very interesting, particularly in the equity issues of all countries having and communities having those issues for affordability. Thank you so much. Over to you, Bernard, for a question to Lamia.
Yeah, thanks, Mani. And yes, Lamia, maybe we take a little bit a change of pace going away from policy, because you've touched also on the knowledge sharing, and of course, coming from the OECD, that's an important part of your work. How do you see public and private initiatives drive both the science and innovation agenda, which of course is a key theme also of this conference?
Yes, Bernard, on the question of public and private initiative to drive both the science and innovation agenda, we know major transformation are needed in sectors such as energy, transport and buildings for regions and cities to adapt and reduce their carbon footprint. And of course, they will need science, technology and innovation to achieve this transformation at the scale needed. At the OECD, actually, we have been looking at this issue from 2 angles. The first one is that we have revisiting this smart city approach. We know we have seen digital solutions proliferating over the past 20 years as a way to ensure quality and efficient urban services with the aim to build more efficient and livable cities. But the reality is that it was not always the case. But today, what is good is that more attention is paid to how smart cities can deliver better opportunities and an outcome for well-being for all residents in cities, with the important role for the public authorities. And we have seen that this trend has been further accelerated by the pandemic. We have seen that cities have been using the momentum of the recovery and also starting from the start of the pandemic to put people and the environment back at the center of digitalization of their smart city approach, using technology to promote a greener, more inclusive model of growth. And we have a dedicated program on smart cities and inclusive growth, which precisely aims to support those efforts and provide support local government leverage technology, not only to improve, again, more efficient public services and infrastructure, but focusing on improving the resident well-being. And part of this work, of course, is to look at the incentive that national government can provide to help cities reaching this objective. And the other thing is that we have been also looking, and we continue to look at the relationship between the private and the public sector, because initially we all know that smart cities was largely supply driven, with the private sector taking the lead in defining both the problem and the solution. But today, with this new context, more attention is paid to how smart cities and technology can deliver, again, better opportunities and well-being for all. And here, national and local governments play a bigger role than in the past. The second angle is the one of local public sector innovation. We know that subnational government, they have different capacities to deal with the issue. We know that we have to help many subnational government from around the world to get the right funding, but also to build the capacity within their own local administration. That's why over the past 3 years, the OECD has been working with Bloomberg Philanthropies to gather data on regions and cities' innovation potential. And we have identified how cities are investing in innovation. We are now looking at how the capacity of cities to innovate and use data is actually translating in tangible outcome in terms of improving resident well-being. And this research, for instance, which relies on a survey across close to 150 cities, shows that environmental quality is the second most common policy areas where cities apply innovation. And we have also evidence that cities with higher levels of public sector innovation display better air quality. So we have been able to assess this relationship and provide evidence that there is a link between a capacity of cities to innovate within its own local administration and the impact on the air quality. One last point about knowledge sharing. Of course, this is at the core of the OECD work and methodology. We have, on the city side, we have been contributing to this effort by providing a wide range of platforms and forums where regions and cities can exchange experience, etc., good practices. We have, of course, our own initiative with 60 champion mayors for inclusive growth. We work closely with the C40, the UCLG, CLIN, and many other city networks. But what is really important for us is really to create, to bridge the gap between the national and the local, to better connect mayors and ministers. They do so within national context, but in an international setting, this is not well advanced. So this is our crucial effort, is really to bring together this different level of government so that we can reach a common objective. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Lamia. And these are all, of course, big themes, the people-centered smart cities and how that links to climate change, but of course also what drives innovation at the cities that we will continue talking about throughout the conference. So thanks very much for that. And with that, we are at the end of this. Oh, sorry, no, over to you, Mani. I'm jumping ahead of myself.
Thanks, Bernard. We have a question for Dr. Isaac. So you spoke quite a bit about the opportunity for multi-level governance and cooperation between some of those. You gave some examples of the municipality working with the national government, et cetera. What else do you think, just briefly, because I know we're running a bit short on time for the panel, what are some other things that you think could be done to affect a just transition, sort of dealing with that equity issue?
Thank you. The urgency and the magnitude of the current climate-related change and the challenges call of the emphasis on the strong and effective governance system and practice. Enable conditions include capacity building, fiscal empowerment of local governments, public participation, and local mandates for climate change actions. Supporting the legal framework and the point that it's important, data collection and sharing. And the other point is important is political will. Okay, the most vulnerable to COVID-19 are also those most vulnerable to climate change. Integrate investment to reduce vulnerabilities, including through which investment of COVID-19 recovery funding is vital. National governments need to ensure that climate action and economic recovery are mutually supported, and that is investment are scaled and new and economic financing, and in particular climate financing, could help with this to ensure that the burden does not spiral of control, in particular as we're entering a period of rising capital costs. The Innovation for Cities Conference cross-cutting theme is justice and equity. When we rebuild cities in the aftermath of COVID-19, we must ensure that the green recovery delivers socially and just equitable outcomes. Adaptation and mitigation strategies must be developed under participatory and inclusive structure and deliver the co-benefits such as improving health outcomes, promoting economic development, and delivering jobs and addressing gender and racial inequities. Climate justice requires that climate action is conscientious with the existing human rights agreements, obligations, standards, and the principles. Those who have contributed less of the climate change on just the level, and disproportionality softened its harms. They must be meaningful participants in the primary beneficiaries of climate action, and they must have access to effective movement. A just transition must be a managed transitions facing the climate change means major change in your economic and societies. And this will naturally bring significant impact on the individuals, families, and communities that touch the core of their identities and will begin. A just transition cannot be an afterthought. It is an integral part of climate action and the responsibility for all us. A just transition must be human-centered. This is accomplished through the strategic planning, public policies, and the perspective for new opportunities for gender of the common will gain, but better social safety. This is necessary needs much also position the transition. It's a pressure to time, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was a really great summary of how important all these issues are, particularly linked to the pandemic. So thanks so much. Over to you, Bernard.
Thanks. And now, of course, we are somewhat running out of time, but of course, we now have really the pleasure of having Deborah Roberts on again. You've seen her before in the video. Deborah is the key person we've been working with to get this conference up from the IPCC, but Deborah is also the head of the Sustainable and Resilient Cities Initiative Unit in eThekwini Municipality in South Africa, and of course is here as the co-chair of the IPCC Working Group 2, and of course also the involvement in Edmonton. So without further ado, over to you, Deborah. What are your key takeaways from the opening session of today?
Thank you, Bernard, and really thank you to everyone who's participated in the session. It's been such a rich session. It's hard to boil out some of the key messages, but what really was left with me as a key message, and it came from Special Envoy Bloomberg and indeed Executive Director Sharif, is that if we're looking for innovation, if we're looking for action, cities are really the laboratories where that implementation agenda is going to be anchored. But as Executive Director Sharif indicated, just as this conference took so many of us working across the globe to deliver, we're going to have to harness that potential through strengthening our global governance at all levels. And we're going to have to localize our actions. And so having cities at the table in all levels of governance is really important. Professor Francois Engelbrecht really highlighted for us that we exist at a unique moment in our species history. We face a future where it's more likely than not that we are going to achieve a dangerous level of climate change, 1.5 degrees Celsius. And therefore, our response, if we're going to harness this energy of local actions, cities as a place where we see innovation, really need to be transformative rather than incremental. And so the challenge is much higher than the kind of debates we had in Edmonton. We now need to up our game significantly. One of the things Francois really highlighted for us is if the reality is in fact a dangerous future, we need to be thinking about how we adapt to that future, and really called out the importance of understanding the financing that's necessary to fund that transformative transition. And that's where really science can be helpful to us, a focus in on how much it's going to cost. What can we do to reduce those costs through preemptive action? So clearly there's a research gap there in terms of putting figures to the costs and the opportunity of reducing those costs through early action. Both of our local government representatives, Councillor Ben Henderson and Mayor Rudwani, I expected nothing less from them. They spoke to us about real action on the ground, and Ben was really honest with us. He spoke to us about the real challenges that local governments and cities face. We're bold, we set targets, but we keep missing them. Implementation is extremely difficult, and Ben was really honest about that and really pointed to the need to look closely at where we put the money we have. How are we spending our capital and operational budgets? How do we use them to best effect? And really underscored the fact that one of our big impediments is financing. So
to me, Ben really highlighted the importance of coming up with measurement metrics to track our progress, and their science and research can help us with that. Ridwani also spoke to us about that sense of urgency that he's seeing at the local level. The question is, how do we deal with it, that big implementation question? And he pulled out one of those key threads that we heard from the Executive Director, Sharif, this need for a new governance model. The fact that we need to focus on co-design, that we need a new roadmap to action if we're going to harness this ambition, and that we need binding action on all partners if we're going to tackle Councillor Henderson's challenge of missing targets. We need to have all partners bound to that. So Mayor Ridwani really called out to us the importance of radical participation with civic contracts, and that speaks to me about the importance of research looking at creating the sense of belonging, the importance of social science research, enabling us to understand how our communities work and respond. Director Lamia Shamal Chawi spoke to us about COVID putting us climate change back at the center stage of local governments, that there's a real opportunity now in using that momentum around the pandemic to drive a move to a green recovery. And that we've seen a change in governments, that cities and regions are now widely recognized, but there's still a need to keep bridging across those different levels of governance. But she also underscored something very important, that climate change is not a one size fits all. It affects areas differently, and areas have different areas to respond. And that to me was a big call out for the research and science community. That granularity is really important. We're good at global assessments, but we need to drop those down one or two levels. Francois Engelbrecht spoke to us about a regionalization in the work the IPCC does. I believe we need to go further. And finally, Dr. Hugh Isaac spoke to us, I think, very eloquently about a critical issue, which we've heard before, the need to prioritize the most vulnerable as we rise to this challenge of moving our cities into the 21st century. So we really need climate action plans at all levels if cities are going to be the innovators for change that all of our speakers spoke about. And he highlighted something which I believe is important going into the COP. He spoke about the importance of infrastructure, including blue-green infrastructure. And again, I think that's a big research gap for us for nature-based solutions. So I come away from this particular session with a lot of hope. It's clear that cities have taken the science to heart. They are responding. They're increasingly at the table. But the real challenge I'm hearing from everyone here is how we turn planning into implementation. This is a very different world to when we met in Edmonton in 2018. And so I think the real challenge, certainly to the science community I represent, is to refocus from understanding the risks to helping develop that urban toolbox to respond and harness the innovation that we see at the local government level. Thank you, Bernard.
Great, thank you so much, Deborah. And this is the first session out of about 200, and I totally agree. We have had a very, very rich conversation, and I think you have already summarized the introductory chapter to the final report. So thank you very much for your fantastic summary there, Deborah. So with that, I'm very happy to hand back to our MCs, Ellen and Megan.
Thank you, Barney and Bernard and Marnie. Before we sign off, let's check in with our fabulous conference illustrators, Desiree Lanos, and to see how she captured our first plenary. So if the host can spotlight the illustrator. We look forward to seeing all the illustrations that will come out of this conference from yourself and Lulu over the next few days. So for everybody else, please enjoy the rest of the conference, and remember that if there are any sessions that you weren't able to get to, these are available for instant replay later. And please also take some time to see the Cinespace for virtual field trips.
Please also provide your one song to our conference Spotify list and add your thoughts on the conference themes in the survey and Padlet boards in the Knowledge Center to keep the discussion going. I hope you enjoy the next live sessions that are just starting now in the parallel session space. And remember, if you have any technical questions, please just head to the Help Center. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much to all the panelists. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.